The Fire Store, equipping protectors with passion. Every decision the Fire Store makes as a company is about its customers. As the holiday season has quickly approached, explore a wide selection of unique and practical gifts at the Fire Store's Gift Center. Find the perfect presents for firefighters, EMTs, and first responders today. The Fire Store's goal is to get you the gear you need when you need it at prices you can afford. Visit thefirestore.com for everything but the truck and shop its family of brands including Streamlight, MSA, Lion, Fleer, and more. Hi, Chris McClune here with Fire Apparatus and Emergency Equipment. Welcome to this episode of our podcast. This is our third water delivery episode. Again, we've got Andy Soccodato and Bill Adkins with us. There are two. They've been manning the water delivery fort here for me when we've been talking about these topics. Today we're going to be talking about intake valves and how to specify one properly. As we came up to this, I found myself really starting to think about some of the maintenance items that are involved with this, based on the fact that I was at a fire truck training conference at the beginning of October, and one of the classes there was taking one of these apart, servicing it, putting it back together, which does fall to the EVTs from time to time when the rig comes in. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me again. To just jump right off the bat here, when I think of what I believe to be the intake valves we're talking about are the ones that we're going to find on the pump panel, not necessarily the intake valve for the rear intake or the front intake, which, you know, on the rigs that my fire company has purchased in recent years, all of our large diameter intakes and discharges have been electric valves. So we're not talking about them. We're talking about, you know, the valves that go on to the side, right at the main connection to the pump, where you're going to take water straight in. So just to clarify, we are not talking about those other ones. We're talking about what we'll be connecting 5-inch to, or and not the intakes with electric valves. That's what we're here to talk about today. Some may think, you know, like, well, what is there to think about when you are choosing an intake valve? Why spend a lot of time choosing that intake valve? It's open, it's closed, you know, really not that much more to it. Andy, I'm going to start with you. What are some of the things that they need to be thinking about, and why do you need to even think about spec'ing out that intake valve properly?
Absolutely. So I think, you mentioned the difference between like a front and a rear and side intake. For me, I really think that it's important, regardless of whether or not you're specifying a front intake, a rear intake, or just have side intakes like most traditional pumpers have. The key here is making sure that you have a way to control the flow of water into your pump, right? And there are essentially two types of intake valves that you can get. You can get an internal intake valve, which kind of goes along what you were saying, Chris, about front and rear intakes. They typically, most apparatus manufacturers are going to be equipping those intakes with an internal intake valve, typically an electric intake valve in today's world. Although I have seen some folks specify a manual internal intake valve on a front or rear. Or the other option is an external intake valve, which is typically what a lot of folks spec on their side intakes, whether it be the driver's side or the officer side of the rig. So those are really the two types of valves that you can, or categories, if you will, of valves that you can find in the American Fire Service today. And they both come with their own sets of advantages and disadvantages. One of the big advantages of your internal intake valve is that I can order it on the side, or either driver side, passenger side, front, rear. And I can have everything all electric, and that can be good if that's how you want to spec your rig. But the major advantage of that is typically, depending on the valve that you're speccing and requesting, you can typically get a pretty big, clear, open waterway into your pump. So if you're speccing a rig that's going to be doing a lot of large water delivery, that might be something you want to consider because it's going to give you a clear, large, unobstructed waterway. I know one manufacturer on the market today is making one with a 6.4-inch internal opening. So that's really, really appealing in certain applications. But the one major disadvantage of having an internal intake valve is from the maintenance side of things, like you said, Chris, they can be a little bit of a bear to do some work on because typically it involves taking the entire pump panel apart and, removing all the accessories on that side of the pump panel and then, breaking things apart to get to where I can do whatever type of service repair that I need to do. Whereas on the flip side, an external intake valve is really typically can be a little bit cheaper to purchase. It's a good option for a department that's maybe putting something on an older rig that maybe didn't have an intake valve to begin with. But what I love about them is that they're easy to remove from the truck, do a quick repair, and then put back on the rig. Typically a lot of times in-house in a minimal amount of time, depending on what you're dealing with. But, those are kind of some of the advantages, disadvantages. But the biggest thing that I think viewers should take away is that regardless of whether you decide to do an internal or external, they both have their advantages, disadvantages, and everybody has to evaluate that for their particular rig. The key is having a way to control the flow of water, right? And I see a lot of rigs that are purchased today that come from the factory with no internal intake valve on the large 6-inch steamer connections, drivers and officer side. And some fire departments don't have any plans to put a larger valve, or maybe they only are going to put one intake valve on one side of the truck. And a lot of times that comes down to money, or just not understanding the versatility of having intake valves on both sides and what that allows you to do. Not to ramble too much, but it's important to look at when we look at NFPA 1901 and now what is 1900. The standard says on intake valves that the rig has to come with at least one valved intake on the apparatus. And if you're not paying attention when you're spec'ing and purchasing a rig, if your rig is coming with two steamers, 6-inch intakes on driver and officer side, and at least one 2.5-inch auxiliary intake, a lot of manufacturers will put a ball intake valve on the 2.5-inch auxiliary inlet on the pump panel. And that technically meets the requirements of the standard. Even though I have my two large intakes, whether I'm going to be taking 5-inch, 4-inch from a pressurized source, or I'm doing drafting that have no ways of controlling the flow of water either into or out of the pump. So I know it seems a little funny to think about it this way, but I like to ask folks if they would ever buy a pumper that had a discharge that wasn't valved. And the answer is almost like, why would you ever buy a truck that had a discharge that didn't have a valve? Because water would always be coming out of the truck. Same thing on the intake side of the pump. I want something to control the flow of water into the pump and or out of the pump. And that gets into when we get into more advanced scenarios like dual pumping and intake to intake connections, stuff like that. But the moral of the story is, in my personal opinion, whether it's internal intake valve or external intake valve, every intake should be valved.
How about you, Bill? Why spend a lot of time? Why spend a lot of time choosing that intake valve?
Well, we've all been on those scenes where we're pumping to our firefighters. We are pumping, relay pumping, and we're starting to set up a draft or hooking up to a hydrant, whatever that may be. How many times have you taken off your steamer cap and water starts flowing back at you? These intake valves prevent that from happening. And when you're taking that water out of when water's coming out of your intake, that's affecting the crews that may be on that discharge side of that pump as well. You're losing that water, that volume. So, and another disadvantage I want to note with the intake valves, the internal ones, is when if you hit a hydrant that has a lot of pressure to it, or someone is relay pumping to you, those valves are not very strong to open up. So if that pressure is pushed onto that valve, a lot of times the power of the intake valve, we'll call it the motor, won't overcome the pressure that was coming from that hydrant or that relay pumper.
Especially, Bill, like you say, especially if folks don't exercise them routinely, right?
Right.
If the valve does not get exercised, right, not a lot of pressure will prevent it from opening. So that's an important thing too. That's even on your manual valves, right? The exercising of those valves is critically important to ensure that they're going to work.
What should go into selecting an intake valve? I mean, now that we've opened up that can of worms, there are probably a million of these things you can choose from. Obviously, like you said, Andy, you're going to have to look at your own operations to determine what you're going to do. But okay, so say you go with Bill, you just mentioned something. You're going to with the electric valves. You want to make sure that whatever you're specifying will overcome whatever the pressure, the hydrant pressure is coming in, or the pressure from where you're drafting, to ensure that it will open or that it'll close, like that it can overcome that. Bill, you mentioned taking a look at Andy, you mentioned taking a look at your operations to do that. But now, so say you decide to go with the external intake valve. What goes into actually selecting that? What are you looking for? Bill, I'll start with you.
A max flow. So not all intake valves are created equal. You can get one if you look inside that. We'll say you buy a 5-inch Storz fitting, and look inside that intake. If it narrows itself down, you're not going to get the max flow you feel like you're going to get, because you're looking at that Storz fitting and you're thinking, well, it's 5-inch. It's going to flow what it's supposed to, and when you really take a good look at it, it restricts itself, and you're not getting that full 5 inches of water volume coming in. So when I'm looking for a external intake valve, I'm looking at two things. Can I control it manually? Like, am I able to open that valve with pressure put on it? And two, how much water will it flow? I mean, what's the intake flow for it?
Andy, how about you?
Yeah, just to piggyback on what Bill said, right? The biggest thing for me is max volume. So, what's really important to understand in the municipal fire service, right? Most of our pumpers, we're dealing with 6-inch steamer intake connections, right? So whatever we're putting on our truck, right, is threaded to a 6-inch connection. So it is, just because, like Bill said, just because you have a 5-inch Storz that you're going to be connecting to your intake valve, that doesn't mean that the valve body on the other side is giving that full unobstructed flow. The biggest thing to understand is that, in order to thread onto those threads, the intake valve has to have some sort of shoulder to be able to, connect. And that is naturally going to eat into that 6-inch feed, if you will, into the pump. So buying an intake valve that has the biggest opening is going to be critically important. And as of this recording right now, in the American Fire Service, there's a manufacturer that makes a external intake valve that has a 5.25-inch waterway, right? So that opening is 5.25 inches. That's the biggest one in today's market that you can get. If you're not careful and you're not paying attention to these things, you can get a cheaper valve from the same manufacturer that is only a 3.5-inch opening. So you're going from, if you're running 5-inch hose, a 5-inch feed coming from your hydrant or other pumper coming into your intake valve, being choked down to 3.5 inches and then going to your 6-inch opening. And in those instances, that's going to kill you on those larger flow scenarios. And it typically is the result, or what a lot of people will see is, man, my intake gauge is reading, less than 20 pounds, but my 5-inch supply line or 4-inch supply line is rock hard. Well, the reason is there's so much loss, going from one side of the valve to the other, that it is affecting your flow. So there are ways that on the fire ground that you can overcome that. It's really going to boil down to multiple intake operations and the like. But I can avoid a lot of that if I just spec a valve that has a big opening. And one thing I like to tell folks with regards to the external intake valve is ask yourself, how often is it a possibility that I will draft? And the reason that's important is in the American Fire Service, there is a belief in a lot of ways that in order to draft, I have to remove the intake valve to hook my hard sleeve up. And that mindset, I would say, is valid for valves that were built, up until the last 5 or 10 years, because most intake valves, external intake valves, that is, if I were going to draft through them, the restriction was so much that it made it to where it was restricting me to the point where I couldn't get a decent fire flow, and the valve hurt you more than it helped you. But now we're seeing these 5.25-inch valves on the market where, yes, there is still a little bit of restriction, right? 3/4 of an inch of restriction. However, I can reliably expect to get 1,000 gallons a minute, 1,250, depending on a lot of other factors, out of a single intake valve. And by having the intake valve on that intake, it gives me options. It doesn't drain my pump when I take the steamer cap off to hook the 6-inch hard sleeve up to it. It allows me to do alternative drafting techniques that don't require a primer in the event that the primer fails, right? So it kind of opens up the door to be able to do some of these other techniques, and it simplifies the operation. So with that being said, when I'm talking about drafting, and if there's a good likelihood of having to draft through that valve, I always recommend to people consider outfitting the portion of the valve that you're going to be hooking your hose to on the fire ground side, not to the pumper side, with 6-inch male threads, because now it allows me to easily connect my hard sleeve to the intake valve and do a drafting operation. And even if I'm going to be taking pressurized water from 5-inch or 4-inch, if I do any decent amount of drafting, I'm still going to do that 6-inch thread configuration, because all I have to do for the pressurized operations is put a 6-inch female to 4 or 5-inch Storts adapter on my intake valve, and now I can deal with pressure. Some people will, if they do a lot of pressure and very little drafting, even if they do a little bit of drafting, they'll outfit those valves with a 5-inch or a 4-inch Storts fitting. And what that requires you to do is either remove the valve for a drafting operation or use a 5-inch Storts to 6-inch male adapter for drafting, which you can do. But here's the key that folks have to remember. If you're going to try and draft through Storts fittings, you have to make sure you have the right gaskets. There's 2 types of Storts gaskets: pressure rated gaskets and drafting gaskets. Drafting gaskets have a rib on the outer edge of that gasket, and it is designed to create an airtight seal under a vacuum. If you don't have at least one of those gaskets on one side of the connection, you'll never be able to get an airtight seal, and you'll have problems drafting all the time. So some people like to do it that way, and it does work, but it also is another hiccup. I prefer the male threads because I know that with a gasket in that hard sleeve and a mallet, I'm not going to have a problem. And under pressurized operations, I use that adapter and I can take a pressurized feed. When it's time to draft, I pop that adapter off, I hook my hard sleeve up, and I'm ready to rock and roll.
Okay, what about, and I don't even know if this is something that you would need to do. That's why I'm throwing it out to you guys. Is the intent to match the valve to the truck? And I guess where I was when I came up with that question, I guess what I was thinking about was, the capacity. Do you need to match the the valve to the capacity of the pump, or to ensure those types of things? Like, is that even necessary? Do you even worry about matching it to the truck, or is it just once you figure out all the other stuff about what type you're going to go with, whether you're going to with the threaded connections and all that, do you just worry about the valve itself, or do you worry about trying to match it to whatever the truck's capabilities are? Bill, I'll start with you on that one.
Yeah, that all depends on the size of the pump panel that you actually have, and if we'll take a puck pump for instance. That's a small space for an intake valve to sit off of. So a lot of times with a puck pump, we may have a intake valve that does not curve necessarily down. It'll just be a straight intake valve. So with those type of pumps, you may have a lot of things that it could block your view to get into other valves. So we want to not block any other type of intake or discharge, whatever it may be.
Andy?
Yeah, so I think the big thing to take away is, rather than get down to like, okay, I'm spec'ing a 1,500 gallon per minute pump, my intake valve needs to be able to flow 1,500 gallons a minute. The better way to think about it is, the larger the opening, the better. Always go with the bigger opening, right? Even if it is going to cost a little bit more, it's not going to hurt you. It's going to help you. And here's the big thing to remember. When we're getting into larger flow scenarios, I did a flow test not too long ago with a particular valve where we were capable of flowing in excess of 2,000 gallons a minute through the single valve. So a lot of these bigger body valves can flow a lot of water through them by themselves. But what is more important to understand is that in the real world, in those scenarios where I might be flowing 2,000 gallons per minute plus, I'm probably being fed by another rig, and I'm probably, hopefully, using multiple intakes simultaneously to achieve that flow. So what I tell folks, especially when we look at things from a drafting perspective, right? If you're sitting here saying, well, I want an external intake valve that can flow 2,000 gallons a minute through it from a draft, I'll tell you, you're not going to find one on the market. And here's why. If we look at the 1900 standard and the old 1901 standard, when you look at how pumps are rated to flow their maximum capacity, a 2,000 GPM pump using two 6-inch intakes, it needs two intakes in order to achieve 1,500 GPM. The break off from being able to do it with one intake to going to two intakes is at 1,500 GPM. So in my mind, if I'm flowing 1,500 GPM or more, I need to be using two intake valves, period, whether that's from a draft or from a hydrant. Right. So if I understand that and then take away that really what I should be spending my money on is a valve that has the biggest body, then I really can't go wrong. In addition to, like what Bill's saying, making sure that it is not cramping my pump panel and spec'ing the valve with the actuating arms or whatever in the right configuration.
Speaking of the pump panel, is it better to figure out what valve you're going to buy and then sort of try to lay out the pump panel accordingly, or wait until you go to an inspection and kind of figure it out after that?
So I think it's something that really, your intake valve, if you're purchasing a new apparatus, whether it's internal or external, even if it's external, that's something that should be written into your apparatus spec and drawn into your pump panel drawings. Because believe it or not, I've seen rigs come in where the department says, no, we're going to get an external intake valve and we'll worry about putting it on. And then in order to get it there, it has to be in some wacky configuration. The handle's weird. I went to one fire department where the particular intake valve that they were using has a little round knob on the crank, and the pump panel was behind a roll-up compartment on this particular rescue engine. and the valve would fit, but because that roller ball was just a little bit too fat, the door wouldn't close. So they had to take that roller ball off and take it to their machine shop and cut it in half in order for the door to close. Like, those are things that you don't want to find out after you take delivery of a truck, right? In my opinion, write your spec, figure out what intake valve you want before you build the apparatus. Now, that might change if I'm getting a rig or I'm putting an intake valve on a rig that I've had for 10 years. That I'm probably just going to have to play with a couple different variants of the valve to try and figure it out.
Bill, how about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I've seen the same thing at other departments where they've had that intake valve twisted, and now the handle, if you had a discharge off the side, it's going to hit that discharge every time you twist it. So you have to kind of let go of that ball valve and try to manhandle it with the just the wheel, little small wheel. So like Andy said, if you have an apparatus that's already been in your possession, you can't really change anything about that. But when you're building an apparatus, you can have them plumb that wherever you need it to be.
Now, Andy, you had mentioned it was not the same context of what I'm going to ask here, but you mentioned how the the valves of 5 to 10 years ago that have come into play are a lot different than the ones we used before. So just in light of that, I can remember way back at my own fire company. I don't remember what we were doing. Maybe it was in the middle of a large diameter hose drill, and we were trying to figure out where a pressure loss was. And we determined that there was some friction loss in the valve that was causing the problem. Talk about some of the valves available that you don't have to get into like manufacturers and stuff, but like in general, are the valves being built today? Are they being built to address that type of friction loss that we experienced? And so are they designing them so there's not as much, or at least it's minimal?
Yes, absolutely. I can tell you with certainty that the two major intake valve manufacturers today, they are addressing that and making sure that at flows, they're kind of testing it at flows up to 2,000 gallons a minute, and they're trying to make sure that the flows the friction loss at those flows are minimal. I'd have to look at the literature, but we're talking less than 10 pounds at 2,000 gallons a minute type thing. And from a friction loss standpoint, during a pressurized operation, that's huge. Where it gets into a little bit, when you do the conversions, 10 PSI of positive pressure on the drafting side is a little bit more than what is capable with one intake valve, and you're still going to need two intakes for that. So to my knowledge, right now on the market, there's no external intake valve that you're going to be able to draft 1,500 or more through. You're still going to need to be using two intakes. And again, that meets the letter of the NFPA standard. So it's not the valve's fault. It's just, unfortunately, it's physics, right? In a lot of instances. But yes, the apparatus manufacturers, the major players in the game, they are being very mindful of ensuring that there's minimal loss in their appliances, because they recognize that valves of, our ancestors' valves, we were having scenarios where we had plenty of water and plenty of pressure on the other side, but there was so much loss within the valve that it was killing us in a lot of ways.
Bill, what's your take on that?
Yeah, so you have the ball valve style, and then you have the piston style valves, and you're going to have a difference in friction loss, and whether whichever valve you choose. The old style is way out of date compared to what they are today. Just like anything else in the fire service, it's come a long way in the last 5 to 10 years.
Now, Bill, in a couple of episodes ago, when you were introducing yourself and when we were talking about hydrant systems, you are lucky enough to be in an environment where the hydrant system is really top notch in your career job. So and mine's pretty good. I mean, as I've mentioned before, our water department here did a lot of work on the water mains 10, 15 years ago that really increased, the main sizes. and the pressure getting through them. They relined a lot of them if they didn't replace them. So for those of us that do have that type of a water system, what do you do? What do you do to dump pressure when at that intake valve? Should you need to? I mean, you get a really good hydrant system, and you just don't need all that water for the 3 or 4 bedrooms that are on fire on the second floor. What do you do? What do you do to dump some of that pressure? What do we use there?
That's another great reason to have an intake valve on your rig, because at Lovell we have quite a few hyders that the pressure can be up in the range of 170 psi, which would hurt you. That's a lot of pressure for your firefighters on a line. And one thing I like to do as an operator is I put that intake to my driver's side or where my pump panel is, so that I can gate that down from the intake. We always want to tell our firefighters when you're opening up a hydrant, you open it up all the way. But when you have too much pressure coming in, those intake valves will allow us to gate that pressure down so that we can keep it around 100 psi or 50 to 100 psi. As we use more water on the fire scene, we can open that intake up, to keep that intake pressure where we want it to be, depending on your department's SOPs.
Andy?
Yeah. So the other thing that, in addition to what Bill said with, gating it back, if it isn't going to cause a lot of problems and, you're not worried about, water spilling on the ground or anything like that, a lot of your external intake valve manufacturers, they're providing intake relief valve options as well. So, and they're field adjustable in a lot of instances. So I can adjust the intake relief valve to help with that by allowing it to open up and dump the water as well. Now, that may not be desirable, especially if I'm in the rural setting and I'm operating from, or operating in a driveway where it's going to turn into a mud pit or something like that, or even in the urban setting where, the temperatures may be below freezing and now I have an ice skating rink. But having the ability to adjust my intake relief valve at the valve in the field, to me, is a huge advantage. And it's offered by most of the intake valve manufacturers.
Andy, you touched on this a little bit a minute ago in an answer to another question, but for the existing rigs, what's the strategy for spec'ing out an intake valve for an existing rig? Are you still just going for the largest opening possible? You talked a little bit about the roll-up doors, but you're taking a look at a pump panel that is already it's already there. You can't make changes to it. What are some considerations to think about when you're trying to install a new intake valve on an old pumper?
Absolutely. So I think the first thing that is important for listeners to remember is you don't necessarily have to have all the answers yourself, meaning that there are plenty of folks out there that are willing to help you figure the answer out to that problem. And a lot of times it's as simple as calling your local equipment distributor and saying, hey, we want to put an intake valve on here. We want it to have the largest flow capabilities possible because we want to be standard across the fleet. But we don't know what intake valve would be the best configuration based on our pump panel. And a lot of times these distributors will come out and bring different valves and really just put it on your truck and play around with it. Hey, what works best for our rig? And you know what? We may have brand X on everything, but because this other engine is a 90s model rig and wasn't built, so we didn't build it to consider this intake valve, right? We might have to go with brand Y because it fits better, right? So I think those are the two big things, right? Always stick for the biggest opening and play around with different models of external intake valves to find the valve that's going to work for your department and that particular rig. And understand that some manufacturers of intake valves have more options with handle configurations and placements than others, right? So some manufacturers, it's this valve, this is how the handle mechanism is. It's going to be right here, and that's it. Whereas others, you can get it where the handle's on the right side or the left side or the top, or you can get a wheel or a crank, right? So there's some customization, and that's really where, talking with your, salesman and local equipment dealer could be a really good option.
Bill, any experience there?
Yeah, something I was going to mention at the end of this podcast was actually building a relationship with your sales reps. One of my sales reps that I deal with is a good friend of mine over the years. It started off, he was my salesman, and since then we've hit it off to where we have a very good relationship as far as communication. He's not just trying to sell me whatever he has. Because we've built that relationship, there's times that he's sold me, or he's recommended another company due to whatever he sells himself doesn't fit. And, building that relationship with your sales rep can help you find the right piece of equipment that you're looking for. That's their job is to know those, flows. And when we say we want the biggest opening possible, they have those numbers in the back of their head. They'll be able to help you say, we have an Akron, but the TFT is a better fit for your rig. They'll suggest that if they're your friend. If they're just a salesman to you, they're not going to suggest that other manufacturer.
Yeah, one thing I just want to add
to
that. I'm sorry. One thing.
No, you're good.
I know it's easy for me to say because it's not my money that I'm spending, but I understand that everybody has a budget and we have to be mindful. You don't want to spend more than you have to, but basing a decision like an intake valve solely on the sticker price, right? You're probably going to get something that is less than desirable for your needs, right? So obviously you don't want to buy the most expensive valve out there just because, but it shouldn't be the only factor when purchasing an intake valve. Look at these other variables. Look at, how it fits onto your pump panel and how big the opening is, and then factor that into the price of the valve before you make a decision. Don't use price tag as the only determining factor.
Okay. When we look at some of those cost factors, we also have to think about service. When you're considering an intake valve, how much should a department be taking? How much should servicing that valve come into play? When you talked about exercising the valves earlier, Andy, and in a municipal department, that could be part of the morning apparatus check. Might be exercising all the valves before you go out on the road. Volunteer side. Maybe, depending on when they do their PM for the trucks, some are monthly. But I'm thinking on the volunteer side or the more rural side where they just don't get exercised as much. They just don't get used as much. They're probably going to need service a little bit sooner. And how much of that service can be done in-house versus needing to send it out. So as you're speccing these out, what should servicing the valve be taken into account? Bill, I'll start with you.
Yeah, when it comes to service, I know in Ohio, I don't know how it is where you're from, but we have a lot of hard water and the calcium buildup. We go by manufacturer's recommendation. However, like you said, if it hasn't been exercised, because it's been sitting in the bay for 6 months, you don't have that option, to exercise it regularly. So, having a systematic calendar basically saying it needs to be done in this time frame, and having your maintenance rep, whether a member or it could be a company that you have do it, but they need to take that off, completely disassemble it, and then clean those things off and put it back. The more it sits, the more that calcium is going to sit in there and build up.
Andy, how about you?
Yeah, so I think one of the questions you need to ask your whoever you're purchasing these pieces of equipment from is what the manufacturer offers in terms of service, meaning that I know certain manufacturers want any service items to be sent back to them. And me personally, it's not something that I necessarily want to ship my intake valve back to the manufacturer to have a repair done. There is a manufacturer that offers a service school that you can go to and learn how to rebuild everything in-house. And they give you the ability to, they give you the contact information to order service kits, and, the repair and everything is something that can be done in the firehouse on the shop bench in 10, 15 minutes. So to me, if I'm spending money on a valve, that is a big deal to me, because it's something that can be field replaceable, meaning that I take the truck out of service for maybe 30 minutes tops to make a minor adjustment, and then I'm back rocking and rolling, rather than having to send it to a service shop or take the valve off and ship it back to the manufacturer to have service done. Right? To me, whether it's a career or volunteer department, the ease of making repairs is crucial, I think.
Wanted to talk again. You mentioned it in the beginning. I can't necessarily picture it in my mind how this would be done, but front and rear intakes. Not everyone does this, but I've certainly seen. I'm sure the two of you have probably seen it as well, where say there's a rig at the front of the building, and you're going to lay back down to the hydrant, and it's just easy to hook up to that hydrant through the front intake of the truck or the rear, versus going in through the side. So some departments or some companies, they may spec the external intake valve for the pump panel, but never actually use it. And again, you're going to get into, sometimes it's driver comfort, sometimes it's an SOG. So there's things there, but should there be external valves on that front or the back? Again, I can't picture it in my mind how it would look. But have either of you seen that? Andy, I'll start with you. Have you seen external intake valves on the front or on the back? And the other part of that, just as I'm sitting here talking, is if you go through the front intake, all that talk we discussed with the friction loss almost goes out the window because of the routing of the pipes that need to happen in order to get back to the pump. So, but forgetting that for a second, have either of you seen external intake valves on the front of the back? Andy, I guess I'll start with you.
Yeah, I have seen that, and while it is not very common and not the first option if I were building a truck, some places do it. I know some bigger cities they do that, whether it be for personal preference or cost. The major thing that I don't like about an external intake valve on a front intake especially is now all that water, that plumbing is filled with water all the way to the front of that intake valve all the time. So in freezing climates, now I got to be worried about that front intake plumbing freezing, right? If I'm routinely operating. Whereas if I have an internal intake valve that is typically, depending if you're dealing with a custom cab rig, that intake valve is usually right underneath or right behind the crew cab door. So there's that portion of that plumbing that typically can remain dry in the wintertime, right? But where I see a lot of departments, and this is why, like, if you're a department that has a decent proactive maintenance division, and you can have external intake valves in stock for, when things break. I've gone a lot of places where back, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, pneumatic intake valves were all the rage for front and rear intakes. And I cannot stand a pneumatic intake valve for a lot of different reasons. You don't see those too often anymore now because they don't meet the NFPA requirement for the slow close opening within 3 to 10 seconds for anything larger than 3-inch pipe. But older rigs had them. And what we ran into, the city I worked for in Charlottesville, some of our older rigs had those pneumatic intake valves, and a lot of times the pressure problem that Bill was talking about was a huge issue where the pressure was too high and the pneumatics couldn't open the intake valve. So what I've seen some fire departments do to kind of bridge the gap in the meantime, either remove that pneumatic valve or keep it in the open position and then put an external intake valve on the front intake so I can still operate the front intake. It's less than ideal, but it takes that open close pneumatic out of the equation. The better option obviously would be to replace it with an electric or something like that. But that, I know that isn't always an option, but that is one instance where I see the advantage of an external intake valve on a front intake. But to answer the point that you made about the front intake plumbing, you're right, 100% with that front intake plumbing has loss in it. Okay. And there are a lot of people in the fire service that either refuse to use front intakes or refuse to spec them on their apparatus because of that loss in the plumbing. And here's what I'll say to that. I'm a huge fan of a front intake because of the advantages it gives you in positioning, right? The positioning advantages it gives me. For hydrant work, I can really easily nose into my hydrant, hug a curb, or even jump the curb, put the rig on the sidewalk, and leave a lane open for that later arriving truck company to come in and do their job. And what I like to tell people is the front intake is the easiest intake on the truck to spot for. Because if you can't position for a front intake, you have no business driving the rig. It's the only intake you can see while you're also looking at your target. So kinks in the supply line should be a non-issue. Whereas if I try and position for a side intake, a lot of times what will happen is I'll either be too close to the hydrant to leave room for the truck or other service company, and I get kinks in the supply line. Or I stay far enough away to not have kinks, but I block the road. So what I tell folks is I'll position for that front intake. And yes, there is loss, but most of your front intakes, and again, every rig is different, and I'm just using average numbers. But in my experience, on average, when I'm drafting from a front intake, I can expect 750 to 800 gallons a minute max. I have come across a couple rigs in my experience where I can draft 1,000 GPM through the front intake, but that's not the norm. That's an exception to the rule. So with that being said, I don't really worry too much about the loss on the drafting side, or excuse me, I don't really worry too much about the loss unless I'm drafting, because when I'm hooked to a hydrant, typically the hydrant has some enough pressure to overcome the friction in the plumbing. And one thing that I recommend to folks all the time, if you're doing a lot of hydrant work, especially with a front intake, is to outfit and spec your rig with 6-inch soft sleeve on that front intake connection. I actually wrote an article for FA a couple years ago about 6-inch hose on the front intake. And in a lot of the testing that we did in Charlottesville and other places, we found that it's not unheard of to get 1,500 gallons a minute through a front intake with a single length of 25 foot of 6-inch soft sleeve connected to the front intake. That's pretty average in my testing, that you can get 1,500 gallons a minute through the front intake. But the key is there, that 6-inch soft sleeve at 2,000 gallons a minute, and I'm just throwing numbers out there, at 2,000 gallons a minute, a 25 foot length of 6-inch, you're talking less than 5 pounds of loss. So what I tell people is by using that 6-inch hose on that front intake, it's literally like ripping the hydrant out of the ground, putting it right on the front bumper, and the only loss in the system is the plumbing. And there's nothing I can do about that. That came from the factory that way. So it really is setting up one of the least desirable intakes for the most functional operation, right? And I'm willing personally to, and some people may disagree, but I'm willing to sacrifice a couple hundred GPM for the positioning advantages that a front intake provides me when I use 6-inch soft sleeve connected to it. And I'm also going to be double and or triple tapping the hydrant to be able to get additional feeds into other intakes. So I'll start with my front intake for the positioning advantages. And if I need more water, I'll double or triple tap that hydrant into my driver side, passenger side intakes, and then get the hydrant's full capacity. Or if I'm drafting, I'll start nosed in with the front intake, and then I'll build a second intake into operation, do a twin tube draft.
What about you, Bill? Have you seen external intake valves on the front or rear? Or is that not something that you've encountered in your travels?
Yeah, I've actually seen it as well. It's usually in the form of a quarter turn butterfly valve, usually like on the rear. I don't see too many on the front, but I have. Like what Andy was saying earlier as well with the pneumatic intake valves. Usually, if I'm going to have a rear or a front discharge or intake, I want to have some type of valve. This will allow me to still burp draft if I need to. With it being a pneumatic, when Andy said, when it flips on, it's all the way on or all the way off. Well, with a electronic valve internally, you can control. You can bump up the opening little bits at a time so that we can bump draft. So, but when it comes to in front and rear intakes, I still want some type of valve, but usually I'd like to have it on internal instead of an external.
All right, perfect. Well, I want to thank both of you for joining me again here today. We've covered a lot of stuff. Bill, I'll start with you. If you had one or two takeaways you definitely want the audience to walk away with today, what would one or two of them be?
If for one, have intakes on your rigs, especially the sides, and look for the biggest volume. Do the research to find out which intake, for one, works for your rig, but how much volume can we get out of it? Not all intakes are created equal. I do promise you that.
Andy?
Yeah, ideally, if I can build a rig in my perfect world, I want an intake on all four sides of the rig because it gives me the ability to take water from any direction. And the bigger takeaway for everybody is if there's an intake, you should have an intake valve associated with it. And always, when you're spec'ing the rig, always opt for the largest opening on that intake valve. It's going to pay its dividends down the road.
All right, perfect. Well, again, my thanks to Andy Soccodato and Bill Adkins for joining me here today. If you have any questions for them, we actually are starting to get some in, so it's a great conversation. We're hoping to maybe bring some of them back out in a future episode. But should you have any questions for them or comments, please let me know. I'm at chris.mcloone, MCLOONE at Clarion Events, CLARION events.com. Also, if you have any suggestions for topics that we haven't covered yet that you'd like to see covered, we have the experts here. We will get them out, and we will get those topics covered for you. So again, Andy and Bill, my thanks to you both for joining me today. Again, this has and if you want to see or if you want to check out our podcast archive, that is available at www.fireapparatusmagazine.com/podcast. So for real this time, again, Andy and Bill, thank you for joining me today. This has been Chris McClune with Fire Apparatus and Emergency Equipment. Have a good one and stay safe. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
The Fire Store, equipping protectors with passion. Every decision the Fire Store makes as a company is about its customers. As the holiday season has quickly approached, explore a wide selection of unique and practical gifts at the Fire Store's Gift Center. Find the perfect presents for firefighters, EMTs, and first responders today. The Fire Store's goal is to get you the gear you need when you need it at prices you can afford. Visit thefirestore.com for everything but the truck and shop its family of brands including Streamlight, MSA, Lion, FLIR, and more.